Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I am one of your hosts for today, John DeLynn. It is January 6th, 2023. Happy New Year. We are so excited for kicking off the new year with a really exciting Mormon Stories Podcast episode. Today, we are going to be discussing a new book that has recently been released in the United States and will be coming to the UK and elsewhere, hopefully soon. The book is called Nonverts: The Making of Ex-Christian America by Stephen Bullivant. I hope I said that right. He holds professorial positions at St. Mary's University, London, and the University of Notre Dame, Sydney. He has doctorates in theology, Oxford 2009, and sociology, Warwick 2019. His studies of contemporary non-religiosity have received wide international coverage, including from the BBC, New York Times, Economist, Financial Times, and Der Spiegel. I hope I pronounced that right.
And Mormon Stories, most importantly.
And Mormon Stories. Thanks, Stephen. I should say Dr. Stephen.
That's going to be added. That's going to be added front. The first thing that's going to be on that list.
Mormons. I love it. Yeah, it's like us, the New York Times, Financial Times, all right.
I'll probably get rid of the New York Times now. Like
we bumped the New York Times. I love it. Nonverts explores, I should say, I'll just read a little bit about the Nonverts description. The United States is in the midst of a religious revolution, or perhaps it is better to say a non-religious revolution. Around a quarter of U.S. adults now say they have no religion. In the United States, through the Pew Foundation, these are my words, this is called the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, that the Pew Foundation has kind of popularized. I'll go on to read the description. The great majority of these religious nuns also say that they used to belong to a religion, but no longer do. These are the nonverts, think converts, but from having religion to having none. There are currently about 59 million of them in the United States. So the book Nonverts explores who they are and why they joined the rising tide of the ex-religious. And so we are super excited to have, I'll say Stephen or Dr. Bullivant here, but I do want to bring on my colleague, my partner in truth and righteousness, Nemo the Mormon. Hey, Nemo.
Hey, everyone. How you doing?
Nemo runs the Nemo the Mormon YouTube channel. And also happy birthday. I hope you don't mind me saying Nemo's birthday is January 1st. Mm-hmm. So you're what, 26? Is that what you said?
I'm 26 now. Wow. Yeah.
Which basically means I can retire. If you're as brilliant as you are at 26, I may as well just retire at 53.
Well, I am retiring, so that's fine. Not from this. No one panic. But yeah, well, my work and YouTube balance is being redressed, should we say?
I love it. Well, Nemo, I asked you to help kind of produce and arrange this, so let me hand it over to you to talk about kind of why you're so excited, and then you can give an additional introduction to Stephen.
Well, I'm always really excited when actual experts can be consulted on things, because I am not one.
Why are you snickering, Stephen? You're snickering.
Well, I just the only reason that I've got 4 children, an 8-year-old daughter who only watches YouTube and will only listen to anything I say because I'm on YouTube, and she asked me to give her a shout out. So if she is watching, I just wanted to remember those words because it applies to everything. It applies to everything that I talk about in the day.
Yeah, Stephen's daughter. Let us be the authority that Stephen is a cool dad. If you don't think so, we can be the authority. Okay, Nemo, back to you. Sorry about
no worries. But it's always good when you can consult actual experts who have their ideas and everything backed up by research, and they can talk you through that research, and you can pick their brains. And so, when the topic of why people are leaving the Mormon Church, which is such a critical issue right now, when that comes up, and we have an expert on tap to talk to about that, that's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, so Stephen, I guess we've given a little bit of a brief intro, but why don't we have you introduce yourself, if you don't mind?
Sure. Well, so I'm British. You probably guessed that. I do 2 things. Mostly, like most of the research and the teaching I do is mainly sociology of religion now. That's just the way things have panned out and the department I'm in, you know, I'm kind of the religious studies guy. There's plenty of other people who can do kind of like proper theology. My background was originally in Catholic systematic and dogmatic, as we call it, theology. But then as I was doing my doctorate on dogmatic theology, on looking specifically at the Catholic engagement with atheism and unbelief and agnosticism and secularity beginning in the 1960s onwards, I realized that if I was going to do a doctorate on the theology of anything, I'd need to kind of read up on, you know, the non-theological literature on that thing. So if it was, you know, the Catholic theology of Judaism or the Catholic theology of football, then, you know, I'd want to read the philosophy of football, the philosophy of Judaism, you know, the sociology, the anthropology, the psychology. Turned out at the time that there was surprisingly little work done in the social sciences looking at atheism. This was like, I began my postgrad work just before you remember the Neo-Atheism, it's not that new anymore, but, you know, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens suddenly had these massive best-selling books in the United States. And it was just at this time when it hadn't been anyone's particular kind of focus for a long time. Suddenly it was becoming interesting again. And there was this kind of vacuum of, you know, work to be done. And so I ended up stepping very kind of naively at first, but, you know, obviously, you know, learning on the job, as it were. And then that became more and more of what I did. And I've ended up getting a doctorate in sociology. And it's become more and more of what I do. So the Nonverts book that we're talking about is very deeply rooted in this kind of sociological perspective. And so that's what I do. So I'm a university college professor who teaches mostly sociology of religion. I'm late 30s. I've got 4 kids, you know, and you know, very little else of interest to say about me, frankly.
I like how he says that he just, you know, and so I ended up getting a PhD. Right, because you just end up getting a doctorate,
by
don't you?
Accident, almost.
By accident, they just slip and hand you the certificate,
you know,
right?
They kind of do, you know. Yeah. You sort of
Come on,
like.
I mean, come on, Nemo. You know, get a PhD. I mean,
I'm the least qualified person in this room. I have a bachelor's. That's it.
Well, just go get one, brother.
Yeah, that will do. Giving them away.
All right. Well, I guess one thing I forgot to mention in the introduction is that the focus for today is on kind of why Mormons leave. That's kind of the working title, because of course in the Mormon Stories podcast audience, Stephen, we're all kind of Kremlin watching the Mormon Church to try and see, you know, what its future is. But it's also okay to kind of start at a macro level and kind of zoom into Mormonism. So I guess we've got a million questions, but Stephen, is there any context you want to provide that at kind of the 500-foot view that then we could use to jump into Mormonism?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the book. I mean, the book isn't about. There's been excellent books about Mormonism. I've read many of them. This isn't a book about ex-Mormons, except that ex-Mormons ended up being kind of centered in the book. So it's a book that's it's basically trying to write, you know, there's been all this kind of talk of the rise of the nons, you know, and it's from kind of 8% into the late 90s when, you know, when Western Europe, when Britain is kind of at like 40%, 50% people who say they have no religion. Now, you know, France, you know, all sorts of modern Western industrialized kind of, you know, democracies, you get this kind of secularization that hits. And there's a big debate about when it happens, why it happens. But, you know, by the time you're getting into the 70s, 80s, 90s, it's a pretty big thing, except in America. Now, there was always this kind of talk of like American exceptionalism. You've got Christian America versus godless Europe. You know, and kind of which one's the weird one? Is it that Western Europe is weird, or is it that America's weird? but there was this sense that, well, if America hasn't secularized yet, then there's no reason to think that it will. And then suddenly, and we might talk about this, but different surveys, depending on how they ask the question, end up kind of, charting the phenomenon beginning at slightly different times, all within the 1990s, but certainly by the late 90s and certainly going into the 2000s, the proportion of the population who say they have no religion starts to rise and rise and rise and rise and rise. So now it's probably around a third of the adult population. The data set I particularly focus on in Nonverts, which by now is quite conservative, is looking at about a quarter of the adult population, which is about 60 million people. I mean, this is vast numbers. So the book is trying to give a kind of on the one hand, a readable, accessible, entertaining book for kind of normal people, if I might put it like that, account of how this has happened, and to do it in a more nuanced way than other attempts to do that out there, that I've seen. Now, while trying, yeah, sorry, go on.
No, I love it. And will you put a pin in exactly where you wanted to go? Because I am very, very interested in exactly where your brain takes this discussion. But I do have a quick question, if it's okay. So, I've heard about kind of secular Western Europe my whole adult life. I'm sure there's been discussion and analysis of like when Western Europe was mostly or even like 80 to 90% religious, and like what were the factors that led to the secularization of Europe, let's just say 40, 50 years before these trends start in the US. What is understood about what secularized Western Europe?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an excellent question, and it's one of the great debates. One of the problems we have is that we don't have kind of modern poll. Gallup doesn't come along until like the 1930s or whatever. Like, we don't get kind of modern opinion polling that asks the question. So we're relying on kind of less easy to interpret data. But certainly after the Second World War, and I wrote a book before Nonverts, a few books before Nonverts actually, but a book came out in 2019 called Mass Exodus, which is looking specifically at the Catholic story in Britain and America. And the critical thing is it's the baby boomers, and everyone blames the baby boomers for everything. And the argument is that actually the Second World War had this hugely disruptive effect over the normal kind of transmission of religion. You were brought up Catholic because your parents were, and their parents were, and that kind of stuff. The argument is that the Second World War, especially in Europe, changes normal social life in all sorts of ways, and that the children born after the Second World War are brought up in a very different world than their parents were, for all sorts of reasons. This is to do with, especially in Europe, you get the beginning of these kind of socialized medicine welfare states. You get the opportunity for, this is a thing in Britain, the baby boom generation who come of age in the 1960s are often the very first of their generation to be able to go off to university if they're from the working classes, which therefore means that you're far more likely to kind of, move away from the kind of, the Catholic, the classic example is kind of like Liverpool Irish Catholic ghettos, if you like. You're far more likely to move away from parents, meet people who aren't from your particular kind of bubble. And then the 60s hits, which has all sorts of effects on, sexual mores, on all sorts of kind of moral and social attitudes. And so there's a kind of a big story in Britain. I think that the Second World War, and particularly the generation after it, and then obviously the children of that generation, are then raised in an even less religious context to the one that their parents were, and then you get this kind of generational effect. So with Catholics, and I think we're seeing this with Mormons too. I know this is about Mormonism. Let's talk about Mormons. That you get this kind of second generation effect of kind of a cultural. The people who leave have a kind of a cultural attachment because they were raised in it, and it was such a big part of who they were growing up. So even if you've kind of moved away, even if you're not quite sure what you believe, even if you're kind of like, well, I certainly don't believe that, you still can't not, unless you have a very kind of antagonistic kind of anti-reaction, then you're far less committed than your parents were, far less kind of intentional in the upbringing of your children, partly because you're often now living in a much less kind of Mormon world than you were brought up in if you've moved away. But obviously that kind of cultural belonging, you'll still bring your kids up in a sort of a Catholic way, but a far less intensive Catholic way as you were brought up. And you won't be going to mass every Sunday and that kind of stuff, except when your parents are around. But your kids, when they grow up and become young adults, they're going to possibly not even, it won't mean as much to them, and they've been brought up in a very much more secular world. And certainly they, may not kind of identify even as Catholics by then, but certainly their kids, it'll be one further remove. And it'll be even less, and it just won't mean anything to them. And especially by this time, you get kind of like all these horror stories, and there's plenty of horror stories in the Catholic Church. That you may no longer want to associate yourself with the brand. So there's one thing to say that all my family are kind of, we trace our way back to Donegal, and we're Irish Catholic, and St. Patrick's Day is a big thing, and it's a real kind of family pride. Well, actually, when you get a sexual abuse crisis, then there's less pride to be had in that kind of Catholic cultural belonging. So we're beginning to see that now. Well, we've been seeing that for quite a long time, but that kind of the generations now, unless they've kind of booked that trend, these kids are just kind of completely.
But it seems like Mormonism kind of jumped, it held off a generation. So you've got that decline coming after the Second World War and into the 60s, but then Mormonism almost started to ramp up in the UK during that time, and it's now seeing its decline later. And I wonder whether it was this shifting away from those religious values of the kind of the Catholic Church or whatever, but not wanting to go completely off the rails and maybe moving to Mormonism. You've got these exciting Americans coming up, selling you this idea of something different and new and a big community and that sort of stuff. And then I just wonder whether that's why you've got that almost staggered shift, because when everyone else was declining, Mormons were rising.
Nemo, you're wondering if Mormonism filled the vacuum that general religious defection created?
Yeah, within the UK.
Well, actually, I don't know the UK Mormon context as well. I'm fascinated by it. I've got a student who's converting to Mormonism at the moment, a doctoral student.
Whoa!
Yeah.
Send them to our podcast, Stephen.
Yeah,
and I've got just a brilliant undergraduate student who's just finished, who raised British, raised Mormon, but certainly, and we're going to talk about this with America, because what you find is that you're going to get certain communities that book that general trend for longer. Evangelicals and Mormons are a very good example in the States, particularly. But the ability to create a kind of a subcultural world, having more kids than the average helps as well. But also as having some, there's a big story about the decline of the main line, and that's a much bigger part of the picture in Britain because of the Church of England. But if you're wanting something religious, then you're going to go to Catholicism or Orthodoxy or more. You're going to go to somewhere where there's a kind of a real kind of religious thing to believe if you want that. And that may well be the case with British Mormonism. And I think you're right about stressing the American angle as well, because, Americans are cool. And this has always been, this was the case in the 80s and the 90s. America was cool. It's my daughters, watching. I've talked about YouTube. YouTube. America, TikTok, YouTube. America is cool, and they want to go to America. They want to do whenever they sort of film themselves, they always put an American accent. So there is this kind of cultural cachet of America. And I think the Book of Mormon musical makes a big thing about this as well. And so it's possible that within in the British context that kind of American cool does help. But I think there's other things and one of the things that Mormons are brilliant at, and even outside of kind of the what's it called, the sort of the Jello,
Jello belt,
right?
Green Jello belt.
Yeah, exactly. Even outside of that, they're brilliant at creating these kind of subcultures where even if your neighbors aren't Mormon, you're the only Mormon in your school. Nevertheless, your social life is deeply connected with other Mormons. Your parish is a far bigger part of your social religious life than it is for Anglican members of their local parish or Catholic members of their local parish.
Well, I think it's the several meetings a week and
absolutely.
or the extracurriculars rather than just church on a Sunday.
Well, this is the thing. This is what keeps people in. And the biggest predictor of if a child will grow up to be religious as an adult is religious practice during childhood. So those traditions that kind of give you a big dose in childhood, yes, there's more to kind of react to if you then leave, and it's a much more dramatic kind of thing to kind of leave. It's a far more dramatic thing to leave Mormonism or kind of the Jehovah's Witness or Catholicism than it is to like leave Anglicanism or kind of Presbyterianism, right? But it also does keep people in because that's the way. There's all sorts of studies of kind of religious psychology, but this is how socialization works.
I do wonder, and we're going back to kind of just this question about the secularization of Europe. I wonder if a big part of it is having a world war or multiple world wars on your soil.
Yeah.
Because when America, we were involved in several wars, but we were always sending our troops over there. And I wonder if there's something about the immediacy of multiple world wars, bombs dropping on your house sort of thing that leads to secularization just around the theodicy question of like, if God is all powerful and good, why isn't he answering our prayers? I wonder if there's something about the world wars that contributed to the death of religiosity in Western Europe.
Well,
is that a stretch?
Like any village in England will have one or two war memorials that will list the young men of that village and First World War, Second World War, and there's dozens of names on them who died. I mean, every little village in the UK will have a war memorial, and you just look, and you look at it, and it's like there's four 18, 19, 20-year-olds with the same surname, who die in the Great War, the First World War. So I think there was a kind of obviously there was this kind of massive kind of psychological just catastrophe, but also the Second World War, that's the real kind of break, I think, but also it wasn't just the men who went away to war. The women went away to either work the land or to go and work in munitions factories. And if you were brought up in your little kind of, whatever bubble, Catholic bubble or, Anglican bubble or whatever, you didn't know it was an Anglican bubble because it was everywhere except for the bubbles. But, there's a sense in which it was a big bubble. The first time that you're kind of associating and making friends with people who aren't, from your very immediate neighborhood. And then you get all these kind of flashy American GIs as well, who, kind of turning heads as well. But also after the war, our cities just get bombed. So the inner city kind of tight-knit, urban communities built around parishes and, like the Catholic, geography of, cities, you've got like in places in the northeast of the US, places like Pittsburgh, places like Philadelphia, places like New York, you've got a Catholic parish, every kind of couple of streets. Now, once those, cities get bombed out, and then the rebuilding happens in the suburbs. So, people are moving out of these kind of ghettos. People are moving into a very different world. And obviously that level of social disruption just didn't happen in America. I'm not saying there wasn't a lot of social disruption, but it wasn't at that kind of, unless you lived at kind of, next to Pearl Harbor, it wasn't that your house was destroyed, or that, the slums that you lived in, suburbanization did happen in the US, but it wasn't because, you were living in this kind of, bleak kind of, post-apocalyptic hellscape, which many of our major cities were, by 1945. And you talk to, my parents' generation, we're living in, we're playing in the bombed out ruins of cities.
My dad talks about growing up in Liverpool in the 50s, and it still wasn't recovered. They used to play on old places where houses used to be.
And every so often they'd find an unexploded bomb, and this was the
great fun.
It was not unknown. I grew up in the Northwest in the Lake District in the 1980s. It was not unknown for like mines to wash up on the beach from the Second World War, and the bomb disposal crew would kind of mobilize. This is so I mean, just to emphasize that the Second World War and the First World War, was very different. And of course, that's in Britain. I mean, we weren't ever invaded. I mean, imagine what it was like in Belgium, or in France, or the Netherlands, or somewhere like that. That was really kind of ground zero. I mean, it's probably not a good metaphor to use, but actually, this was a war zone, a literal war zone.
And here I am arguing against my own point, but you also hear kind of the saying, "There's no atheists in foxholes," that somehow war brings out the religious in us all. And so I'm trying to decide whether war would contribute heavily to secularization. I know that the secularization of Judaism really accelerated after the Holocaust, as far as I understand it. So on the one hand, there's the argument that war would accelerate secularization, but then there's always the understanding that heavy levels of adversity or strife or pain or suffering make people more religious. So I'm more confused now than I was.
Yeah, but it's the next generation, because the baby boomers have the most privileged, war-free, upbringing and this new prosperity. And it was obviously even more so in the States. You get this kind of post-war boom, this kind of great economic growth. We still had a rationing into the mid-50s. One of the things I quote in the Mass Exodus book is that, Americans invented the all-you-can-eat buffet in California in something like 1954. And, that was the year that, like, meat and sugar stopped being rationed in Britain.
And so the Mormon temple was built in 1950s.
Sure. The secularization is the next generation. But you're right that there's no kind of obvious, that the kind of greatest generation, as we call them, there's no kind of obvious, they're still the most religious. And obviously we're getting to the point now where Queen Elizabeth just died, and she helped in the war effort. That my grandparents' generation, there's very few of them left now. But actually that means that the reason why, every year the non-religion goes up is that it's partly generational replacement. The oldest and most religious generation have died off, and every generation after them is much less religious. So it's that baby boom generation who kind of everything's different for that generation.
Yeah. Okay. And so, Nemo, I don't know if this flagged a notice in your mind, but the Book of Mormon does predict that prosperity leads to a loss of faith, doesn't it?
I was thinking, at what point of the apostasy cycle are we in?
Yeah. Yeah. Did you know, Stephen, that you're just merely quoting Joseph Smith when you?
I did not know that. I didn't. But again, I mean, it's think the Book of Mormon is a fascinating document.
But I think the Book of Mormon's right there in a sense that one of the things I discovered on my mission when I was out trying to convert people is I was in Surrey and Sussex. Very wealthy people don't tend to need religion. If you're not feeling like you're in need of something...
as far as they sent you?
Yeah, that's as far away as they sent me.
No.
So yeah, the people aren't in need of religion because they've got everything that they feel they need. So well, actually, you go to someone's mansion and you're like, oh, do you need God? No, I got a Ferrari.
Well, actually, this is one of the other big arguments in kind of post-war secularization is the rise of the welfare state. The rise of this kind of social safety net. The fact that so much that used to be provided by the churches is taken into the hands of the state means that it's often called existential security, which is the kind of the phrase that gets used, the jargon that gets used in the sociological literature. But this is one of the arguments as to why it is that Western Europe becomes much less religious than many other parts of the world. And the argument always is that even though America is the most kind of prosperous, the disparity between the rich and the poor and the lack of a safety net and, the numbers of people who, don't have access to, who aren't insured for healthcare, and like the kind of like, if things go badly, they can go really badly in a way that they can't go quite so badly in Western Europe. I don't want to kind of idealize this, but one of the arguments is that kind of existential kind of fear is a bigger part of the post-war American story than it is in at least parts of Western Europe. So again, that's one of the other big arguments that gets made, is that kind of people live a far more comfortable life after the Second World War. And especially that generation, that first generation, the baby boom generation, these are often the first, obviously you get things like all sorts of kind of cool stuff that kind of comes over in the 50s and 60s. But, this is very often the first generation who've come to university, for example. The first generation who've kind of been homeowners. There's all sorts of things that contribute to this generation and their descendants being kind of cushioned from the harsh existential realities that probably many of their previous generations hadn't had to had kind of faced on a much infant mortality goes down. There's all sorts of things like this that kind of are lessened, and again there's a huge debate around sociology of religion, but this is one of the factors that is often argued as to kind of playing into secularization.
Okay.
So Joseph Smith has many sociological friends in this respect.
Before we dive into Mormonism, how do sociologists, psychologists, social scientists, how do they assess the benefit or cost of the secularization of Western Europe? Do they view it as having overall been a good thing, a bad thing? Communities, mental health, is it viewed poorly or is it celebrated?
Well, it's different. I mean, sociologists, social scientists are the most secular of all the. You often think, well, it must be the physicists or something. It's the social scientists. The anthropologists, sociologists are the most atheistic of all academics, right? So you do get, and there's been some really interesting work done in the States. Christian Smith wrote an excellent book. There's been other really interesting work done on this kind of secular bias that you get within sociology. Okay, and this goes right back to Freud, Marx, Comte, Durkheim, Weber, all of whom were varying degrees and in different ways, kind of non-religious and with a kind of a obviously in different ways, but with and meant it. So there's always this argument that kind of the sociology and anthropologists are biased against religion. Now, obviously it's a big field and there's there's different. So this is kind of like a very big picture. Generally speaking, I think the social sciences see it's hard to generalize. You do get social scientists who think that, well, actually, we've lost a lot. We've lost all sorts of social capital. Kind of Robert Putnam kind of social capital kind of stuff around. Churches, irrespective of truth claims, which sociologists and anthropologists always like to bracket out. You do lose something when these kind of critical hubs of social community and belonging dissipate. There's a huge literature looking at religion and mental health and religion and health generally that suggests that more religious people have better health outcomes in all live longer and happier and all sorts of stuff. Now sociologists tend to say, well, actually that's not the religion, that's sort of things that aren't the religion but are associated with the religion. So it's not religion, it's the community belonging. It's not religion, it's the kind of whatever. So you often get this kind of, well, we need to kind of build secular, and few sociologists are saying what we need to do is bring back God and re-evangelize the country. But they might say something like, well, okay, we don't have parish churches, but we should do more about community organizing. That's the kind of the big thing in America, isn't it? Community organizing.
But the cynic looks at it and just says, well, people only really get together and join together in a community
Absolutely.
if they're afraid of God. So
the thing is that people only join together if they actually care about the thing that they're joining together for.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to build community for the sake of community.
Mm-hmm.
People will band together in all sorts of ways. I talk about this in the book, around all sorts of kind of weird niche interests. It doesn't have to be religious. I talk about bronies in the book, which we might talk about. I talk about Chris Gaines fandom, which dates me rather, in the book. In fact, Nemo has no idea who Chris Gaines is.
Who's this?
It's a soft rock alter ego of the country singer Garth Brooks. A short-lived alter ego of the country singer Garth Brooks.
Okay.
Exactly. So I've just lost, all readers of Nonverts are just completely lost at this point, and So but one of the arguments is that the internet and Robert Putnam. I talk about Robert Putnam because he wrote a very famous, best-selling not pop, but it was popular, serious sociology book that was sold vast numbers, which is always a dream. Called Bowling Alone, where he was talking about the decline of community and the kind of all the sorts of negative knock-on effects this then has in a society. And one of the things he talks about, and this is like 2001, is that, well, the internet may be mitigating at least some of this, because the internet allows people to kind of find people who are into their particular kind of interest. And this could be like, BMW fans, or this could be kind of, foot fetishists, or I don't think Robert Putnam uses that example. I do. But it does allow people to come together. So people will happily hang out with each other. People will happily devote their hours online to arguing about minute points of kind of Star Trek canonicity and timeline, right? But they won't do that to kind of just hang out with people because it's good for them. So there is always that thing. You can't
That's
kind of
focus.
Exactly. People will congregate, but they need a shared interest, vision, and obviously religion has, for much of society and history, been the thing that brought people together.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Okay, so even though the secularization in Western Europe really started accelerating after World War II, if I got that right, somehow it held off. We might even say 2 generations in the United States. Is that right, Stephen?
Yeah. So this is the big question. Like, I mean, the 60s, you could almost call America the epicenter of the 60s. The kind of all the upheaval, riots, civil rights, Vietnam, women's lib, all sorts of, and like religiously, you get kind of liturgical reforms in the Catholic Church. You get all sorts of changes, and this battered the mainstream, especially the mainline churches in the Catholic Church. attendance starts going down, and they emerge battered from this. But what you don't get in America, but you do get in Britain and other places, is that you don't get this kind of sudden growing of non-religion. Now, in America, that only really, it kind of goes up a bit. So if you look at Gallup polls from the 1940s and 50s, it's kind of like 2% of the population say they have no religion. And actually, if you dig into the figures, it looks like a good proportion of those are Chinese immigrants. So like they're kind of Confucians or whatever, right? And it's kind of, well, this isn't a religion. And there will be, those people who are non-religious, some of them will be kind of like, conscious atheists or agnostics who've thought about it and have reacted, and college towns and certain places like Portland, Oregon are going to be kind of particular hotspots, but it's still very small and very kind of socially weird. But after the 1960s, it goes to around kind of 7-8% and stays there for about the next 25 years. It fluctuates a couple of percent or up or down, and it's only at some point in the mid to late 90s, and certainly by the early 2000s, that it grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. So,
Stephen, sorry, you may have already answered this, but what do sociologists, social scientists, how do they explain America's, United States' ability to kind of fend off that secularism? Maybe you've already said it, but can you summarize that for us?
Yeah. So there's again, it's a diverse field. There's all sorts of arguments. One of the arguments is just to say, well, it doesn't really need explaining. It's you who are weird. So, and this is fair. This used to, you kind of think, well, this is fair enough, because it used to be European sociologists would look at America and say, well, America's not doing what Europe does. And that needs explaining, because
when is it ever?
Well, yeah, you think, right? But so Max Weber at the beginning of the 20th century, goes to America, and he does exactly what kind of I did. Goes around America, talks to people, and then sort of declaims on the state of American religion, right? And this is a classic thing of European intellectuals, like Charles Dickens does it, G.K. Chesterton does it, Alexis de Tocqueville very famously does it, right? And he comes back and says, well, actually, it may not be, it's very religious now, but obviously because Europe has secularized, then it won't be long until America does, because Europe is the kind of the vanguard of civilization, if you like, right? And it just doesn't happen. And so the argument is, well, American sociologists, people like Rodney Stark, for example, or Peter Berger, eventually would say, well, actually, maybe Europe's the weird one. Maybe it doesn't need explaining. Maybe we need to explain why Europe secularizes, why other places don't. And there's something to this, right? So I absolutely agree that, first of all, I don't think America is kind of doing something called Europeanization. I think it can secularize in its own interesting way, right? Also, Europeanization, like Europe is a very diverse place with very religious and very non-religious places, often side by side, okay? We don't need to kind of see it as a pattern. And it does seem to be that there's something about Anglophone, like places like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Britain, that tended to be the vanguard of secularization. So it may well be, I mean, and America is the outlier in those countries. It may well be that, there's something about those that we need to, why did they secularize so fast?
Got it.
But nevertheless, now that America, and it really, I mean, like you will get very serious, far more sort of, starry sociologists. I mean, people like Rodney Stark, who I have a huge amount of respect for. He's written a lot on Mormonism, of course.
Tell our viewers and listeners what he projected Mormon growth rates to look like back in the 80s.
Yeah. So I mean, and this was, so he kept saying, and this was right when he said it, was that, well, if you look at kind of Mormon growth rates, and I've not read the particular paper, but it's like look, Mormonism is growing by X% every 10 years, and every time this has been pointed out, sociologists have said, yeah, but it can't keep doing that. And Rodney Stark rightly comes along and says, yeah, but it does keep doing it. And every time you come up with a reason why it's going to stop, then it keeps doing it. So maybe we should kind of, a bit like, the Chicken Little or whatever, maybe we should just stop assuming it's going to stop, right? And it's going to keep growing and growing and growing and growing. And this is when he starts talking about Mormonism as this kind of like the new world religion. It's not a new religious movement. A new religious movement is the word that sociologists use because rightly they don't like the word cult. But when they use the word new religious movement, it's what normal people think about cults, and absolutely you can understand why. Especially because they're not new anymore. This kind of term doesn't fit groups like the Seventh-day Adventists or groups with millions of members worldwide, for example. It seems strange to use these of the same sorts. If I set up a religion tomorrow in Bicester in North Oxfordshire, you'd call it a new religious movement. It seems odd to regard that as the same category of thing as a 200-year-old tradition with millions of members worldwide. Okay, but equally, people aren't putting these on the same level as Buddhism, Judaism, Hinduism, these kind of
not part of almost the big six
religions. Exactly. So Rodney Stark comes along and says, well, actually, the way it's going, the numbers, it keeps growing, and it keeps growing not only in America, where like everyone else has stopped growing, but it's really growing in all parts of the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. Then, there's going to come a point when, like Christianity splitting off from Judaism and kind of doing its own thing, and after a certain number of years, you say, well, actually, it's no longer kind of a weird variant of Judaism. It's its own thing. Mm-hmm. Then, you can absolutely see where the analogy is going to say that, well, actually, Mormonism is to Christianity, is to Protestantism what Christianity was to rabbinic
especially when the predictions were 36 million,
absolutely,
anywhere between 36 and 121 million by 2020.
Actually, I'm seeing anywhere between 64 million,
right,
and 260 million by 2080.
And if you say, well, actually, this is like there's meant to be about 15 million Jews in the world or something like that. So, like when you're talking those numbers, you can see why. You might say, well, I think there's meant to be about 9 million Mormons in the world at the moment. Maybe I made that number.
The church's own numbers say 16 million.
Right,
but
yeah.
There's questions, you've got to dig
I'm sure you've discussed these, right? And actually, this is something we talk about in the book. Who counts and how you count is itself a very interesting question.
The Mormon Church does very accurately. They just don't tell anyone what the actual numbers are. Well, sorry, go on.
No, but this is...
Stephen, while you're getting a drink, we estimate between 4 and 5 million active faithful Mormons in the world.
Sure.
We've got good access to the UK data. We reckon about 12% activity.
That's that's fascinating, actually. I'd love to talk more about that because this is something that interests me very much. But equally, you could, if you played this game with other, like Anglicans in the UK, for example, like if you count people who actually turn up to church, very much smaller than even the people who get their kids baptized and, kind of tick the box, right? Catholics, again, talked about this in another book, but, that cultural Catholicism keeps people ticking the box long after they've stopped believing or practicing. But even so, there's plenty of people who don't really believe who were in church on a Sunday, actually. But actually, lots of people who would absolutely see themselves as Catholic wouldn't dream of not having a Catholic wedding or a Catholic funeral, would absolutely get their kids baptized and probably think it important for their grandkids to be baptized. But, won't darken the door of a church very often at all.
I think you see a lot more of that in Utah if you were allowed to. The problem with kind of the Mormon attitude is that it's an all or nothing attitude. But if you allowed secular Mormonism, you would see a lot more of that, particularly in Utah, where essentially someone's entire culture is Mormonism. It's green jello, it's funeral potatoes, it's everything. It's not to reduce your culture, John, to those two things, but it's all around them.
Wait, Nemo, who's the active, faithful, devout Mormon?
Well, yeah, that's true. But here in the UK, you've got something to step away to, right? You've got something to step out into, whereas in Utah there isn't necessarily. Although there is a rising counterculture, which is exciting.
I suppose Salt Lake City is is different in terms of it allows that kind of more cosmopolitan space. But I mean, going back to the Nonverts book, talking to some of the interviewees who were brought up in kind of southern Idaho, towns where everyone was like literally. One of my interviews says like he was 8 until he met someone who was like a non-Mormon Christian, and he rang his mum. Like he was just astounded by it. And again, but equally, you can understand why in those kind of situations, either you conform. I mean, and I don't think it's simply the case that people, don't believe, don't practice, don't believe, but just to conform, but they're kind of complete. Because I think we're so influenced by people around us, but although it's possible that you kind of just going through the motions because of family, because of jobs, because of neighbors, but people who, really can't live like that move out. And you're right that in Britain that, you don't have to do that. You just stop going. Right. But this used to be the case in those kind, Catholic Liverpool or Catholic Preston or kind of Catholic, Pittsburgh or New York or Philadelphia, like kind of the Catholic ghetto in inverted commas, where all your neighbors were not just Catholic, but probably Italian Catholics or Czech Catholics or Irish Catholics or whatever Catholics, right? Living in that kind of situation really does help to cement one's own commitment, but also for those who, for whatever reason, end up wavering or being outcast, then you leave because it's just.
Can I just pose a quick question?
Yeah.
On that point, to ask John this really. Everyone views people, the Brits, as traditionalists. We have these amazing traditions, this pageantry that everyone loves.
We do a funeral and a royal wedding well.
Yeah, we do it well. But America is the land of immigrants. And everyone is so obsessed in America with where they came from or where their family came from before they got to America. And do you suppose that some of America's holding on to its religiosity for so long is to do with people's feeling the need to hold on to their parents' traditions and to hold on to their ancestry more than it is about their actual religious belief? And so they identify with their Irish Catholicism, with their Italian Catholicism. They need to hold on to that lineage because every American you meet will tell you where in Europe their family comes from.
Apart from England, no one ever says, "Oh, I'm 8th generation."
Because we're boring.
Yeah, none of them do, and it's really interesting. My favorite example of this is the national. I keep talking about Catholic stuff. The National Catholic Shrine, whatever. In Washington D.C. has literally it has a chapel to the Our Lady of every single immigrant community's favored Mary, Our Lady of Knock for Ireland or Our Lady of Fatima for Portugal, right? There's about 50 of these chapels, Korea, Vietnam, Japan. The only one it doesn't have is England. And it's come on. It has Wales, I think, and it has Ireland. It doesn't have England. It's come on. No one is proud of being English in America.
No, and why should they be?
And exactly. I've seen Hamilton enough times. There's a history there, and it makes sense. But I think you're right, that especially that cultural belonging. And this is something that comes up when you talk in the book. So we'll get back to Mormonism, and there's a reason why Mormonism is particularly kind of front and center in the book. But there's 4 separate kind of deep dive chapters of different kind of denominational worlds: Mormonism, mainline churches, evangelicals, and Catholics. And it's really interesting that one of my interviewees was raised kind of Polish Catholic, but he was Catholic because he was Polish. The parents didn't practice. It was important that they went to Catholic school because they were Polish.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a real kind of Catholic history buff in the way that many ex-Mormons I know are kind of really into Nauvoo numismatics or something like that, right? Right. But there is that kind of ethnic, cultural, family belonging. But again, and I think this changes, and I talked about this earlier in the interview, or whatever this is, conversation, was the sexual abuse crisis really tarnishes that. You might still say Irish, but the Catholic bit might be something you mentally is something that you're less keen to attach yourself to. It's a bit like, and it's very much like this. It's a bit like kind of being culture. What's the word? Like kind of cultural fans of a particular sports team, right? So like when a particular sports team wins the Super Bowl, there's suddenly all these fans who you didn't know were supporters of whatever team, but they can give you chapter on verse on how their father was always a massive fan, and they're from a long line of whatever
What's
fans.
that, Manchester United fans, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they're suddenly getting the shirt out and getting shirts for the kids, right? And I'm a Nottingham Forest fan, so we've had those fans in our lives. But what happens is that when those teams aren't doing well, then those fans kind of you still got the hardcore, but that kind of bigger penumbra of people, legitimately, it's not that they kind of like invent that's their team, but it only kind of is made real and manifest when there's something to kind of hang it on. There's a particular, I forget what it's called, but there's like social psychologists have studied this, that this is something that people do. Like when college sports teams, like the day after,
you might call it bandwagoning.
Yeah, absolutely. The day after that they've won a game, that you talk about our team, we did well. If they lose, it's like they were terrible.
Oh, it's like Andy Murray, the tennis player, was always British when he won, but Scottish when he lost.
Oh yeah, well that's exactly what they say. Exactly, it's exactly that kind of effect, and I think we do see that because the thing is about religious belonging is that identity in all sorts of ways is very complex, and especially in secularizing societies such as in Britain, is that you get a lot of people who can tell two stories. And this is even more true in America, even if they don't believe, they don't practice. Even if they never practice, they can say something like, well, yeah, I guess I am an Episcopalian because I was baptized and my parents are, and we got married at the Episcopalian church, right? But equally, they can tell an equally honest, equally true story about how they're not at all religious because they don't believe any of it. They're atheists. And they think it's all nonsense and they never even go to church and all that kind of stuff. So the nature of the thing is that there's this kind of huge middle in societies of people who are kind of half in or half out, and depending on, and we see this on surveys, depending on how you ask the question, can kind of nudge a certain proportion to tick one box or the other. And it will do that consistently. So different ways of asking the question can get kind of big differences in the number of people who say they are, Episcopalian or Catholic or whatever.
John?
Really quickly, just not to jump back to the Rodney Stark conversation, but if I'm kind of doing an analysis of why Rodney Stark's predictions failed, I would say it's a couple things. One is that a lot of that exponential growth that the Mormon Church claimed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was built on kind of fraudulent statistics. And what I mean by that is, Stephen, I as an example, served a 2-year Mormon mission from 88 to 90 in Guatemala. And, our mission baptized up to 700 people a month. There were companionships in my mission that baptized up to 40 people in a month. But oftentimes these were 7, 8, 9-year-olds. The parents weren't involved. It was these rich, white, well-dressed American teenagers showing up in these super impoverished towns, baptizing these little 8, 9, and 10-year-olds without parental consent, without them even attending church, let alone having any sort of conviction, and then them falling away. Never being active for them to even have any belief or participation to fall away from. And so whether it's Chile or Brazil or Guatemala or the Philippines, a lot of those numbers were padded by statistical baptisms that did not represent actual conversions. So that's going to be one, and I'm seeing you nod your head, Stephen, so I'll pause and give you a chance to jump in, and then I want to give my second point.
Well, just to say that that's something I've heard a lot, and there's been studies done, and again, I'm talking to people who know far more about this than I do. But I think Rick Phillips is the guy whose name is in my head for certain reasons on this. Studies of you actually look at censuses where people have answered the question versus the kind of the official numbers, and absolutely that's the sort of thing. But you see this in other denominations. So in the Catholic Church, if you're baptized, then you're Catholic forever. There's nothing you can do about not being Catholic. You can't leave the Catholic Church, really. So, I mean, actually, the Catholic Church doesn't count. I mean, technically, anyone who's validly baptized, which isn't Mormons, it's kind of everyone who's baptized except Mormons, almost. But technically, sacramentally, if you look into kind of deep sacramental theology, anyone who's validly baptized is really a Catholic, because there's only one baptism and there's only one true church. It's far more complicated than that, really. But actually,
Catholics have been doing the one true church shtick way longer than Mormons.
Original and best. So, but actually, the way that you count people has all sorts of bearings on the numbers that you get, obviously.
Yeah. Nemo and I think we agree on this, that it's disingenuous for the church to claim 17 million members. It's certainly fair to say, well, we count people that still privately identify as Mormon but don't attend. If the church wants to count those people, that's fine. But when you've got, like you mentioned, a Brazilian or a Chilean census that shows a fraction of the membership that the church claims by the self-identified, individuals themselves, then it's disingenuous for the church to.
And I think it's just a point for Stephen's benefit is the church does have this data. The church, and in every unit, the ward clerks, so the guy who's responsible for the admin and the finances and that sort of stuff, they will count. They will take a quarterly count of bums in seats on a Sunday, so they know just how many members are attending every congregation.
And they also know how many people are lost, and they centralize the records in Salt Lake City, and they know how many people are just completely lost to the church. And
well, actually, this is something that comes up in the book, because there's various people I interviewed who have had also as you'd expect, like if you leave the Presbyterian Church or the Episcopalian Church, it's not a big deal, and everyone kind of expects that you will, right? If you leave the Mormon Church, then it has to be a big deal, and there's a big kind of family thing, and it's often been very traumatic for all concerned. And so several people of the people I interviewed said, well, look, I absolutely don't see myself as a Mormon, but I couldn't go through the process to actually formally resign, because if I do, then, and I don't know if this is true, but certainly they believed it was true, is that like when my parents go to their bishop for their annual, whatever it's called, meeting.
True.
I think
there's a printout, and it'll say like, you've got all these kids born in the covenant or whatever, and I see that, whoever has left. And they couldn't do that to their mother. It's like, maybe when she dies, I'll do it. But it would just destroy her. And not only like, it's not even like her knowing, it's the kind of the public humiliation of everyone, like it being known. They just couldn't do that. So you get people who, some of them were like, no, I'm sorry, I had to leave, and it's been a massive thing. And now now thankfully we're on, like, it's still awkward, but and thankfully we're back on speaking terms and that kind of stuff. But for some of them, it's just like, look, they know we don't talk about it. They know I don't go. They know I've got a chapel around the corner. Literally, there was someone I spoke to with one of the Kensington Chapel, which is in London, like literally around the corner. You could walk to it. They go when they're in town. They know I don't. We just don't talk about it. But I couldn't take that step, because it'd be like a knife in her heart, and I just couldn't do that to her.
Yeah, and that leads me to the second point. I really like that you've, in your book, The Nonverts, The Making of Ex-Christian America, you talk about, as you already have, these, what do you call it? The micro communities? I'm sorry, I just lost it for a second.
Subcultures or something.
Subcultures.
Like
You're talking about subcultures where your religion is your world. And in a place like Utah or Idaho, it's not just your spouse that may leave you if you leave the church. It's not just your parents that may disown you. It may affect your income. It may affect your job. If you're a dentist or orthodontist, you may lose a huge percentage of your patients. You may lose all your friends. You know, all your neighbors may turn their backs on you, and so there's such a large percentage of members of the Latter-day Saint movement that no longer believe and either attend just to avoid familial or social or financial retaliation, and so they continue to attend, or they silently fall inactive, which is the term that we use. You'll know that, Stephen. And they stay on the rolls. Everyone still thinks they're members in good standing, but they've just silently disappeared because the cost of going that extra step to, you know, ask to resign your membership and ask for your records to be removed from the church, there's just too much potential damage, and that's true in these subcultures. It's a lot less true, as you say, Stephen, in Catholicism or Presbyterianism or Lutheranism or Episcopalianism, whatever, all the isms.
But actually, going back, we talked about this kind of, new religious movement thing, is that it's not like that in bigger, more mainstream denominations, but in lots of slightly less mainstream than Mormonism groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, or another remove the Amish, then that's a really big thing. You get this kind of formal disfellowshipping or this formal shunning. So there's this kind of spectrum that you see in, and there's the whole sort of ways you can categorize different kind of tensions with the outside in religious communities, but actually the LDS is a kind of a middle point between a kind of a formal, that you are not, if your daughter leaves, you are not allowed to be in touch with them. These are people who are kind of persona non grata to the saint, I don't mean in the LDS term, to the elect. And Scientology is another good example where, you can be declared as what's called a suppressive person, that, other Scientologists, including your own family, are not allowed to have any contact with, because you are seen as this, this kind of malevolent element. And so there's a sense in which the Latter-day Saints is very much not that extreme, but there is this continuum of kind of the social pressure to stay in and the costs of leaving. And partly that's an official process, but partly it's kind of like, the stigma of one's friends, or, it used to be the case 50 years ago that, if you were Catholic and you married a Protestant, your parents wouldn't attend your wedding, and, it would be a really big thing. That isn't the case anymore. But equally, you can say, well, that's not the case anymore. But that's also that's both a symptom of and a cause of secularization, because of these kind of subcultural walls, partly kind of officially built, but also a lot of it is kind of social norms and pressures, do help to keep people in, and do really create costs for the people who leave. And this is one of the, it used to be, we're going all over this, and I've apologized to the people in the comments for these kind of wild rambling disquisitions you get from me, and I'm blaming it on the time and the day, but it's a lie. I'm just like this all the time. But it used to be the case that if you were brought up in rural Utah, and you kind of left, then you left, and you probably weren't heard of again. Partly because people, there might have been a letter or a postcard, but you weren't. If there was a black sheep of the family, then you might. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Encanto, but there's kind of we don't talk about Bruno type thing, right?
Absolutely.
But the internet changes that, because you can keep in touch with, hey, what happened? Why 18-year-old female cousin of mine, did you suddenly leave town, or whatever? What's the story there? Or why did you leave? We were just told that you got a job and you had to leave, or whatever. You'd walked out or something. But you can keep in touch with people, but also then it's possible to find a whole community of these people online or wherever. And suddenly there's this whole world of people who are kind of either ex-Mormons or doubting, or know exactly what it's like to be in your position. Possibly like they live down the street and they're conforming in the same way you are. But you have this space where you can talk about this. And there was a brilliant study of people who leave ultra-Orthodox. So this is kind of like Hasidic, these kind of classic, ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in New York. There's a whole kind of ethnographic study of people who haven't left, but they've kind of seceded in place. Like they can't leave because of the family, because they don't want to leave the kids. They don't want to leave their parent, they don't want to leave their wife, but they don't believe. Just going through the motions.
We call them physically and mentally out.
Sure.
Yeah.
But there's meetup groups for them. There's online spaces. There's like WhatsApp groups and that kind of stuff. I think the possibilities of that is kind of exponentially risen with the internet, obviously.
I think what's interesting coming off the back of that is that you raised that point about 18-year-old cousin of mine. Why did you leave? What happens now is the organization or the religion doesn't get to control the narrative about why people leave, because for years they got to say people leave because of this, and all those that are within the community are like, well, yeah, sure. But now there is a place where people can actually share and people can start to learn, well, actually people leave for this reason. And that's the thing I think they're the most scared of, because if you get to control the narrative about why someone left, then you can keep people's fears at bay. It's the same way as like when there's abuse in a congregation. If you can convince all the members that it's an anomaly isolated to your congregation and stop them seeing the bigger picture that it's going on broadly, then you can control it. It's about compartmentalization.
No, absolutely. And this is, again, in fact, I talk about it in the Nonverts book, particularly with regard to Catholics, but not only there's evangelical scandals, but those kind of, you can't keep with it. You can't say to a particular congregation, we've dealt with it, that father, whoever, he's been sent off and he won't ever go anywhere near children again. And, he gets moved to a different diocese. You can't do that anymore, right?
No, because Mike Resendez will tell you exactly what diocese he got moved to.
Exactly. But And one of the arguments is that, well, what kicks off in kind of 2002, the Boston Globe, is that suddenly you get the internet, and then suddenly people just Google it and like, hey, that was the guy who abused me. And we were told that,
it's been taken care of.
It'd been taken care of. And obviously it hasn't. And then we find other people who had also been abused. And this is that kind of the ability to, and also that these stories don't stay within regional silos. That suddenly something can be kind of like national news, or you can particularly look for these stories in a way you couldn't do when you're like kind of reading like a local regional paper or whatever.
So Stephen, really quickly, not really quickly, but so you said that maybe beginning in the 1990s, you start to see that percentage of, did you have it at 7% of non-religious? Start to grow. Let's just go back to the early 1990s, and if you want, kind of give us I don't know if it can be chronological. I believe that 9/11 in 2001 plays an important role in the secularization of the United States. But why don't you just take us through as best as you can, kind of a timelines. I would also put Newt Gingrich's contract with America and the rise of the religious right.
That's one of the things that's often cited, and actually, I think
give us your accounting of the rise of secularism in the United States.
I mean, I think the rise of the religious right is in. I mean, it's often cited as what if you like, the churches, and we've seen this happen kind of even more extreme, but like the churches kind of hitch themselves to right wing politics, and this alienates people. And I think there's a truth in that, but I think the biggest story is that, like, from the end of the 60s, is that kind of mainstream American culture and social mores and morals are moving further and further away from kind of traditional family values. So, in a sense, yes, there is a doubling down from the churches in the 80s, but also it's more that the wider population, including many who were in those churches, have shifted far more liberal. So it's not that suddenly the church has moved to the right. It's that like the culture's kind of moved to the left, in inverted commas, and the church kind of holds its line, or at least aspects of the church do. And then there's this backlash. So I do think that the kind of religious right is important. The big thing, I hadn't realized that this was kind of that original, because it seems fairly obvious, and it may be because I'm coming from the outside. But having read various reviews of this book, apparently this is distinctive. But one of the things I do make a fairly big thing of in this kind of historical narrative as the rise of the nons is the Cold War and the ending of the Cold War. One of my arguments is one of the reasons why the post-war generation and the 60s didn't have this growth of the nons effect that you would have expected from the 60s, 70s, 80s. You know, not necessarily on the scale of Britain, but you'd expect it to go, you know, it went up a bit and then stayed where it was for 25 years. I mean, that seems odd. One of my arguments is, well, this was kept kind of, if you like, artificially low because of the Cold War. And in America, you know, we had a Cold War here, you know, 3 miles away, you know, there was a USAF air base with, you know, nuclear weapons pointed at Moscow. You know, we were up to our necks in the Cold War. You know, my uncles were in the army stationed at, you know, military bases in Germany alongside US personnel. It's not that we didn't have the Cold War, but the Cold War here was not framed in Christian Britain versus godless communism, right? Christian America versus godless communism was a thing. And one of my arguments is this kind of religious framing of the Cold War dampens down the possibility of not just atheism as kind of this un-American thing, but kind of non-religious, thinking of oneself as non-religious. You might think of yourself as kind of, well, I'm Presbyterian. I don't suppose I'm a very good Presbyterian, but, you know, I'm still a Presbyterian. But you wouldn't think of yourself as being not religious, even if you didn't believe in it, if you didn't practice. So one of the arguments is that the Cold War kind of keeps the lid on no religion in a distinctively American way, because it wasn't framed like this anywhere else, right? Plus, the kind of the big, you know, the public atheists in Europe in the 60s and 70s are people like Bertrand Russell or Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus, or kind of, you know, respectable establishment figures, men who are university philosophers or whatever, like respectable intellectuals. In America, it's Madeleine Murray O'Hair, who, you know, is seen as rightly in many ways as a kind of a feminist trailblazer now. But at the time, you know, she was an ex-communist who tried to defect to the Soviet Union and they wouldn't take her. You know, she was divorced. She had 2 kids from different fathers, I think I'm right in saying. So if you read the headlines reporting on, you know, her atheist kind of, you know, organization making, community organizing in the 60s, you know, the headlines are like, blonde divorcee, you know, attacks God or whatever. And that's just not how, you know, Bertrand Russell was being reported in Britain, for example. Anyway, the big thing that happens in the end of the 90s and the early 2000s is that the generation who were either the millennials, who were either born after the end of the Cold War, or, you know, much of their upbringing was...
So my lot.
Yeah, and mine was either after the Cold War or after it was at its real height. You know, like I was born in the mid-80s, and, you know, my only kind of real memory of the Cold War was like watching like Rocky IV or like Red Dawn, you know, on like holiday. Like that was
you guys are laughing at how old I am, basically.
Yeah, but you weren't doing duck and cover because the atheist commies are going to bomb you, right?
Yeah,
right.
No, I was watching Hunt for Red October.
Right.
That's what I was watching.
So the argument is...
Well, I watched Rocky 1 when it came out in the theater. How's that, fellas?
But and like there's a whole kind of... The Borg in Star Trek are very clearly communist. There's a whole kind of thing. You're not getting that, not just after the fall of the Berlin Wall or whatever, but, you know, the people brought up in the 80s are getting less of it, then none of it. And you're absolutely right, John, the kind of the big existential threat isn't people with no religion, it's people with too much religion, and it's religious extremists, and it's Islamists, and then 9/11, and then straight after 9/11 you get the Neo-Atheists, and like Sam Harris, you know, he was the first, and he was the one who wasn't already a best-selling author, you know. He came out of nowhere, and he makes a big thing in that first book, The End of Faith, 2004, that he began writing it on the 12th of September 2001. You know, Richard Dawkins makes a big thing about how he wanted to advertise the television series that accompanied The God Delusion with just a big skyline of New York with the Twin Towers there, and, you know, the John Lennon Imagine No Religion above it. It was very easy to frame not being religious as a patriotic, reasonable response to danger and chaos. So I think that played into it. And also you get the internet. And as I say, and this was much bigger thing, I think, for those communities that had bucked the trend. I mean, like, you know, Catholics have been worrying about, you know, decline for 70s, 80s, 90s. But, you know, the number of nones wasn't high, but people weren't going to mass. Same with the mainline. You know, the mainline church attendance has fallen off a cliff from the 60s onwards. The evangelicals and the Mormons numbers held up pretty strongly. Mm-hmm. And one of the arguments in the book is that in those communities, the internet is kind of what really kind of puts cracks in the subcultural walls. For exactly the reason we've just talked about, you know, people brought up in rural Utah, well, then have this whole world that they...
Because Mormonism has a highly correlated curriculum as well. Like, I always used to say that, you know, no matter where you go in the church... So I went to Germany, I went to church in Germany once, and then I knew I was going to be getting the same lesson as I would be back in the UK, just in a different language. It was just so... The correlation committee did a number on the church to the point where everyone was just getting the same information. And so when they had no access to other information, because they didn't have the internet, then it was fine. Absolutely. But the internet comes in, and all of a sudden you've got, as Peter Bleakley likes to call it, people who are, they have made their testimony of fired clay, and they've got a pot that just shatters because it's been so rigid and so tightly held that it just breaks.
Absolutely. And like one of my interviews, and he was a dentist, and I didn't realize there was a whole Mormon dentist thing. We've talked about dentistry already, which pleases me. But he, you know, and he talks about how he's ethnically Mormon, that, you know, he still hangs out with ex-Mormons, you know, he still kind of sees, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink coffee, he doesn't swear, he doesn't believe any of it, right? But he still is culturally Mormon, right? And he talks about how it was his cousin, and his cousin left, but kept in touch, and had kind of sensed something in him, and kept sending him links like, "Hey, did you ever hear about the Mountain Meadows massacre?" Or, you know, "Hey, we weren't told this about, you know, like Emma Smith's, you know, views about other wives at Sunday school, or, you know, what is seminary, right?" So absolutely, it then opens up this kind of possibility of information, and again in a slightly more extreme way, and I don't actually equate the two, but it's just a clearer and more extreme example. Scientologists, you know, that you get with the internet, that suddenly they kind of, you get it in South Park as well, like this kind of secret Scientology teaching was suddenly like anonymous, kind of put it out there that, you know, it's only if you're a certain thetan level you're meant to get operating thetan, right? But it allows that kind of I mean, it's called democratization of knowledge, but certainly of viewpoints. And, you know, I'm sure that a lot of it, well, the stuff out there is very tendentious, is all, you know, like there's all sorts of stuff out there, but certainly it's the exposure to different information, different views, and a different community of people to discuss it with. And
yeah, well, so the endowment ceremony, the Mormon endowment ceremony, is now on YouTube.
Absolutely.
For example, whereas that was hidden behind walls before, and now that's out there. And
Yeah.
you can talk to non-Mormons about it, so you're not just getting the reactions of those around you immediately in the endowment room, which are your friends and family or whoever's there. You're getting the reactions of people who aren't Mormon at all in the comments going, "What is this?" And you're like, yeah, actually, that does look pretty weird from an outsider perspective.
Yeah.
Stephen, we're just kind of bantering this back and forth a little bit, but as someone who kind of predates the internet, when I was at BYU in 1993, I watched 6 to 10 scholars get excommunicated, and the clear message for speaking about women's rights, for speaking about polygamy, for speaking publicly about racism and Joseph Smith's folk magic stuff. And back then, before the internet, really, the church was able to kind of put this wet blanket over public discourse by excommunicating people and sending this fear of God, fear of Heavenly Father into all Mormons, saying, if you talk publicly about this stuff, you will be punished. So what the church does is it has this sketchy history, the Mormon church, it's got this super sketchy history that it whitewashed for a couple centuries, and that it punished people forever talking about it. And what that did, combined with creating a semi, robust middle class with a lot of high-tech workers and white collar professionals, what you see in the early 2000s are a bunch of us who were paying attention during the early 90s that all of a sudden have the internet, and we start with blogs and we say, whoa, the church has a history of hiding its history and punishing those who talk about it. Maybe we can talk about it on blogs, and there'll be enough of us to where the church, kind of like a Martin Luther King, Selma, Alabama effect, well, there'll be so many people talking about this on blogs that the church won't be able to excommunicate us all. So you see these Mormon blogs emerge with Web 2.0 around 2004. And then immediately you see, as soon as podcasts exist, and there are podcasts, Mormon Stories was started in 2005, but there were Mormon-themed podcasts that predated Mormon Stories podcast. You see a really robust sampling of Mormon-themed podcasts emerging in 2005. And when you combine the bloggernacle, as it was called, with the Mormon podcast, families that emerged in the mid 2000s, then you see these communities really start growing. And then once Facebook and Reddit and Instagram and Twitter emerge, forget about it, as they say in New York. Like, the church was toast, because it not only had to deal with people openly discussing issues that they could no longer control, it had to deal with the backlash of having hid information and suppressed its hiding of information and misleading of people by the punishing of scholars and of people who spoke openly. So at least within Mormon's case, you have to ask, why does the Ex-Mormon Reddit have 250,000 members, whereas any other ex-religious subreddit has a fraction of that? You have to wonder why are there more ex-Mormons on the Ex-Mormon subreddit than ex-Jews or ex-Catholics or ex-Scientologists or ex-Jehovah's Witnesses? And some of it, I think, has to do with some of those dynamics that I mentioned. Now, Stephen, you tell me whether any of that makes sense to you or not.
No, it makes perfect sense. And the other reason, of course, why there's lots of people, you don't get, hundreds of thousands of people on like Ex-Anglican subreddits, right? Or X, I don't know.
The Ex-Anglican subreddit sounds so tame, Stephen.
Oh, it would be, but because they don't get, and this comes out in the mainline chapter in the book, and they don't care enough. There's a quote from Taylor Swift about, it's not like I forget it. I don't love it. I don't hate it. I'm just indifferent. And actually, the interesting thing, and again, it's partly a factor of the swiftness of the non-version, right? So you've got people who were brought up very Mormon, who are now able to find, have now left and have found this sort of whole other world, but they have a kind of a dog in the fight, right? So it's personal. And one of the bigger arguments of the book is about the reason why we're foregrounding non-verts. Why is non-verts important rather than nons? Well, non-verts are important because they used to be something else. And that past is kept with people. It's either like positive or negative. Well, it's often both. So people often have a nostalgia. Obviously, like people's parents, people's families, people's memories are all bound up with the religion. But also, people often have very kind of negative, dramatic, traumatic kind of journeys as to why they left. And often both are true of the same person. Now, that means that you've got people who care, who are interested, who are invested in not just kind of culturally with it, but actually in the kind of other people leaving and it being a massive thing for them. And like one of my former Mormon interviewees talked about it as kind of free therapy, like just kind of having a group of people who know what it's like, who get the in-jokes, right? Who get the pop culture references, who know exactly what it's like to have been brought up like this in this kind of place and to have left and to have to deal with the sisters-in-law and the spouses and the mothers-in-law and everything that goes along with that. And that's why you see a strong kind of ex-Mormon thing in the same way you do less so with ex-Catholics. No one talks about being a recovering Presbyterian, right? But people might talk about being a recovering Catholic because there's something to recover
from.
Exactly. And evangelicals are the most like the Mormons in kind of mainstream America, in that there's got people who have been brought up with something, a serious dose in childhood and early adulthood. And it's often been a very big thing leaving, but also they've been brought up in this kind of, as they see it now, weird subcultural world with its own kind of, its own, like the nice thing, I interviewed two, they were from Texas, I interviewed them in Portland, Oregon. It was a couple and they were just delightful. They're about, kind of younger than me. It was like their one night out, they got a babysitter, I was buying the drinks. And they were just reminiscing about the kind of like the weirdness of kind of evangelical pop culture in the 80s. And it was like, there was this thing called the Power Team, and it was for like kids who were like into wrestling but weren't allowed to watch wrestling. So it was like these kind of beefcakes who shredded phone books for Jesus. And they'd sort of like wear like chains and then shatter them through the Holy Spirit. And there was a whole kind of biblical learning being done, but it was basically a wrestling show, right? And it's this kind of really weirdy, but there was like massive, this was a massive thing in the evangelical subculture, right? And if you were saved at one of their shows, you got to meet them. So like it was like, I think I got saved about 4 times, but like there was massive celebrities, but like anyone who wasn't brought up like evangelical would have no idea what this was, right? They were just watching Hulk Hogan. And it's the same with, and one of the end notes in the book was a lot of fun researching Mormon rom-coms, right? That you'll know that there's a whole sub-industry of, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but it's for anyone who isn't Mormon who's watching this, of
Stephen, half of our audience has never been Mormon.
Right, well, there you go. Okay, so this is worth looking out because they are great films. I enjoy them. But there's like a whole genre of films, and I'm thinking here of The Singles Ward, The Singles Ward 2, The RN, my top 3 favorites. I've never seen Baptist at the Barbecue. I've never seen
No? Oh, goodness.
No, sadly. But those 3, and it's the genre is basically American Pie, but where the end result is finding your forever spouse and having 7 kids and being heavily involved in your ward.
You said you don't speak in sound bites, Stephen. That is the soundbite of this evening.
But that's literally, so and like, I don't want to ruin it, spoiler alert, but Singles Ward is brilliant. I really loved it. Singles Ward is a really good film. But there's a guy who's, he's brought up Mormon, he's not really committed, and like, he makes jokes. He's a stand-up comedian, and then through a good woman, he's kind of brought back into the fold. And then the sequel is like they're a young married couple who are kind of like really active in the ward, and there's probably a baby on the way and that kind of stuff, right? So like, I'm a sucker for kind of Americana and pop culture, right? But what really fascinates me about those films is that it proves, these are kind of professionally made good films, right? This is serious actors, serious, whatever. There's a market. There's a big enough movie-going teen market in the Jello Belt that this is a viable industry. And actually, this says a lot about the strength and size of that kind of subculture, that you can have a film industry dedicated to creating kind of Mormon versions of the mainstream culture. And you see this in a much bigger way in the evangelicals, because you get Christian rock, which is kind of like the classic line in The Simpsons about, it's just like secular music, but you change the word baby to Jesus, right? But there's that exact, when rap's a thing in American culture, you get Christian rap. When like hip hop's a thing, you get Christian hip hop. So the fact that you've got this kind of religious group who can create its own multi-million-dollar music industry and film industry and publishing industry tells you a lot about the kind of the size of these subcultures, these kind of worlds, these bubbles.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interestingly, Stephen, movies like The RM and God's Army, which I'm trying to look at, it came out in 2000. There was kind of this heyday of Mormon cinema in the early 2000s, right as the bloggernacle, the Mormon sphere, and the Mormon podcasting world kind of emerged. Interestingly, that all died out by the mid 2000s, and I don't even know what I can say to account for the death of that industry, but I can't name one decent Mormon rom-com or cultural movie that's come out in the past 15 years.
That needs to be the next book.
They hit the best 2 years, and then that was just it. I mean, what's Kirby Hayborn doing with himself these days? Is he still kicking around?
He is, yeah. But anyway, Stephen, I'm not trying to disagree with your points.
No, but leading into my point, because the point is that this subculture is dissipating for all sorts of reasons.
Right.
And the bigger, the big kind of a wider culture. The reason why the first denomination-specific chapter in the book is the Mormons, right? I lead with Mormons, and I do that for several reasons. But one is because the Mormons were the ones who were holding up better than everyone, and the Mormons were the ones that the other churches were looking to, saying, "Oh, I wish we were more like the Mormons." Not in many ways.
Not theologically.
But they keep the young people. Not only they keep the young people, but they can persuade teens to go and spend 2 years trekking around, rainy Bicester, which I met two missionaries, took them out for lunch here. A pretty thankless task. You couldn't get, persuade, Missouri Synod Lutheran teens to go off and spend 2 years of their lives in each other's pocket, name badge pockets, trekking around.
Not only do they donate 2 years of their lives, but they pay to do it.
Exactly. And so you look, other churches are looking at the Mormons and say, well, there's things that they do, and like the singles wards and all that kind of social architecture around the kind of the Sunday, everything that happens around it, and the seminary and the catechesis. You've got other churches saying, well, if we did that, then we'd be faring a lot better. And then once Mormons are starting to worry about people leaving and non-verts, then there's a real problem. If this is a problem for Mormons, then how much more of a problem must it be in the wider society? So the reason why I find Mormonism so fascinating in this particular context is that once, and Jana Risa's book, The Next Mormons, she talks about this. She's not the only one. And I read a book I've got a Mormon friend who's a sociologist, and he recommended a book by Patrick Hugh Mason. He talks about kind of to address some of these problems. But once, and I think general conferences have started talking about this as a problem. Once the Mormons are worried about losing young people, which is kind of what Catholics and Presbyterians were worried about 40 years ago, right? And nothing that they tried to stop helped. But once the Mormons are worried, then things are really getting
I mean, you've got this gerontocracy at the top of Mormonism, which means they're like 2 generations at least removed from the young people. So I'm surprised they kept young people for this long. I just wonder whether they stopped listening to those that had advice for them on how to keep young people, because they seem to know what to do, and now they just don't know what to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is that this is true of all big religious organizations, is that they only start trying to address a problem when it's
too late,
a generation or too late. So, like, my favorite example of this, and I write a lot on kind of church history, and like the Council of Trent, which is kind of like the Catholic Church's big reaction and response to the Reformation, happens once the Reformation is already kind of out of control, right? Yeah. And you always get this. So by the time you get round to at the top levels to kind of trying to deal with it, then it has to be such a big problem that it's often kind of too late. You might kind of find ways to mitigate and work with and live with the new situation, but they very rarely are reacting at a time when you can actually stop the thing that they want.
I mean, just to put my cynical hat on, it's surprising that a church that claims to be led by prophets, seers, and revelators would have a hard time of knowing what's going to come down the pipe.
Nemo. You're very cynical.
Nemo. Come on, Nemo. Stephen. No, I'm just kidding, Nemo. It's a fair question. From a Mormon standpoint, it's a fair question.
Yeah.
Stephen, so how bad is it for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? How much are they suffering by your estimation?
Well,
and in what ways are they suffering? How badly are they suffering? And how does that look like from your perspective?
Sure. Well, I mean, Mormon numbers are difficult because the kind of the metrics that we have of there's however many ex-Catholics, and about 15 million ex-Catholic nons in America, for example. And because the Mormons are such a small proportion of the whole population, then it's very difficult to get a big enough number of them in kind of these big social surveys to have, to be able to say, well, 20% of people raised now identify as nons or whatever. So the numbers are very sort of hazy. It certainly seems to be the case that it's a bigger thing than it used to be. It largely depends on your perspective. And this is important because compared to kind of almost everyone else, kind of evangelicals, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, Catholics, whoever else, compared to everyone else, the Mormons are doing better and will probably continue to be doing better. Compared to how the Mormons were doing 20, 30 years ago, it's going to feel like, the end of days. And actually, this is important. If you go to Ireland, which I do, and, present statistics on kind of secularization in Ireland, and you say, look, hey, Ireland is one of the most religious countries in the world, but they're not comparing it to the other countries in the world. They're comparing it to Ireland 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And certainly compared to the levels of retention and not just kind of people who were kind of just conforming for this because of it's easier to do that than leave, but actually because we're so bound up socially with each other that it has its own effect of just kind of, families are going to find more and more of their kids, more and more of their 10 kids leaving and not just not attending, but, having their names taken off the rolls or whatever. And, that might be 3 of the 10 kids rather than none of the 10 kids or whatever, which is huge, right? So I mean, but compared to, the evangelicals are going to be doing better than most other denominations in America, but less well than they used to, and it's going to carry on. But still, compared to everyone else, Mormons have much better kind of social architecture, much better catechesis, a much better way of socializing children, both in the home but also in the wider community, into the faith. Those mission trips, again, this will be, no secret to many of the people listening, but certainly the people I'm talking to John and Nemo, that one of the biggest effects of the mission trips isn't on the people you bring in, it's the kind of the galvanizing effect it has on the people themselves. Now, obviously, I know several ex-missionaries who, certainly didn't keep them in, and if anything, it kind of, cemented their reasons for leaving. But on average, it will cement the people in, and you get these films like the RN, to be a returned missionary is a kind of,
it's a
marriageable
phase in
material,
life,
right? But also for the girls' coffin. So compared to everyone else, the Mormons are still doing, are still going to be doing better. But I think the bigger point is that it's becoming a more and more uphill task because the wider culture is more secular. And actually, every time that the number of nons goes up, and every time a book like mine comes up that makes out, that the nons are like this kind of like the rising tide, again, like we talked about before, this bandwagon effect, lots more people think, well, actually, I think I'm a non. And that becomes the, so I think one of the factors in the rise of the nons was like every 6 months there'd be a new, news headline from Pew saying that the nons are rising. And people would be like, oh, who are they again? Nuns? Oh, no, not. Oh, yeah, that's what I am. Yeah. And then the next time you tick the box.
So that's why I kind of made that cynical comment about prophets, is because, as you say, we, as members of the church, or for the members of the church, you see people leaving, they're comparing themselves not to the rest of religiosity, because there's this exceptionalism within Mormonism that it is the one true church, that it is led by a prophet who speaks for God. So the disappointment comes when, hang on, this man who's meant to be able to lead and guide us isn't able to stop the people leaving compared to the thriving that we did have. So they're not worried about how, I mean, they're starting to now. For example, the church's president recently said in a trip to Europe, or it was about a year ago now, he said, secularism is indeed on the rise in Europe, but the church has a bright future here, don't you worry. So they're starting to acknowledge they're starting to compare us to the outside world and say, well, actually, we're doing better than them. But a lot of members will be internally kind of comparing ourselves to our expectations. There's a lot of expectations within Mormonism that the church will just continue to grow, it will roll forth, it will fill the whole earth.
Sure. And actually that's going to, it's going to slow, and it's going to be, as I say, it's going to become harder and harder work.
So Stephen, what I hear you saying is, there's a broader problem of religious disaffiliation in the United States, but it's not hitting the Mormon church nearly as hard as it's hitting other churches, and that by comparison, the Mormon church is still doing pretty well. If I look at kind of boots on the ground, what I'm seeing in my family, in the families of people that I talk to, and this is admittedly just definitionally anecdotal, what we're seeing is a massive wave of disaffection and disaffiliation, where it's very, very common now. If I just do a random sampling of my listenership, 50 to 80% of their siblings who are all raised Mormon have either left or no longer attend or no longer believe. And so, and maybe some of this is confirmation bias, but what we're seeing is the church really in free fall. We're seeing the church declining to release its membership statistics. So imagine, Stephen, for decades and decades, maybe even over a century, every single year when the Mormon church held a general conference, it would release its statistics to the membership. And then just a few years ago, it all of a sudden just announced it's no longer going to be releasing its membership. The church does these internal customer research polls or inquiries where they hire social scientists, and they're constantly now sending out these surveys to active faithful Mormons saying, why do you still attend? If you're having doubts, what are you doubting? What would be the things that made you leave? And of course, just like with pornography 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, the church just could not stop talking about it. Now you see Mormon church leaders, they can't have a meeting without talking about how many people are leaving and why the members need to stay. And so it's a tiny bit maybe, well, it's not what maybe many of us would expect to hear anything other than sort of Chicken Little, the sky is falling. But again, there's probably some confirmation bias in that.
No, I think it's more that, again, this perspective thing, because I mean, there's a sense in which, you know, if you're raised, I keep picking on the Episcopalians, you know, if you're raised Episcopalian, then, you know, it would be noteworthy if one of your siblings or cousins attended church. You know, not that half of them no longer do. You know, it would be astounding if any of them do. So I think it's more about the fact that the norm within the LDS has been so high for so long that, yes, I mean, you know, this is a huge fall, but compared to how low many of the mainstream, the much bigger denominations are, you wouldn't expect, you know, someone, you know, in their late teens or early 20s to be darkening the door of a church, you know, and it's
sure.
So it's more, and actually those churches have stopped talking about it because it's no longer a thing that bothers anyone because they're so used to it, and people are delighted when a young person attends church rather than worrying about, well, where are the other 10% who aren't. It's like, wow, we've got a young person, wow. And
yeah,
it's
whenever I go to like an Anglican church or something,
yeah,
it's
you're like, wow,
you know,
there's a young one.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, like the village church, you know, it's a village church, but I mean, there's probably about 6 people there on a Sunday, and you know, you could probably say, well, in 10 years, you know, there might be one who's still alive. I mean, it's that kind of difference that we're looking at, and the evangelicals are the most kind of like the Mormons in that respect. And it's interesting, there's suddenly in the past kind of 10-20 years, there's suddenly been this kind of a huge industry of books about prodigals. So the euphemism within evangelical churches seems to be, we talk about prodigals because that's hopeful. You know, if your son or daughter has left the church and doesn't go to church anymore, obviously if they're prodigals, and you know, there's the hope that they're going to be back again. So there's this kind of vast industry of books about praying your prodigal back home, you know, like, and obviously, you know, you don't get those kind of books, you know, in Episcopalian, you know, maybe you did 50 years ago. But now it'd be like, you know, it's more literally, they're not going out after the one sheep. They're going out, you know, it's out the 99 sheep, you know, who the shepherd needs to go and find on the hillside. So, but it feels a bigger deal within the LDS because it is a bigger deal because religions and because you're used to the norm and you're used to it being much stronger. But I think not in no way to say that actually everything's fine, but more that compared to everywhere else is much, much worse or much, much better, depending on how you think about these things, of course.
Totally. So again, we're talking to Dr. Stephen Bullivant. The book is Nonverts, The Making of Ex-Christian America. Stephen, I'm curious, and this may not even be part of your book, and it may not even be part of your research.
Surely you've read the book, John.
Oh, well, normally I do. Normally I always do, but I have not this time, so I'm just going to be honest.
I'm excused. It's not available. It's not available in the UK.
Oh, it is on Kindle and Audible, Nemo.
Oh.
Is it an Audible, Stephen?
It is on Audible, yeah. You don't get my dulcet tones reading it. You get like a professional actor reading it, but yeah, it's on Audible.
Okay. Well, we will be reading it, and I encourage everyone to buy it. Again, the book is Nonverts, The Making of Ex-Christian America. What I read was the Jenna Reese article. That was kind of what Nemo and I did in preparation for this one. And that's
fair, Jenna Reese's article was very good.
Yeah, actually what happened was we decided to interview you based on Jenna's article. And then as I was prepping, I'm like, whoa, this book looks really cool. So maybe we'll have you back to talk about the book. But what I was going to ask is, Stephen, do you do any analysis on what churches are doing or can do to stem this tide? And do you have any specific ideas what, if anything, the Mormon Church could do to keep to slow the hemorrhaging? Or is that not part of what you do?
This is a big part of what I'm I've gone the other way. I was raised as a non, which is very normal in Britain, and became a Catholic at university, and I'm practicing Catholic. And so a lot of my time is spent kind of thinking about. I've written a lot of kind of books about the decline, and obviously there's some of the next books are looking at what happens next and what could happen next, and what ought churches be doing, because we're not suddenly going to bounce back to where we were 50 years, because just the situation has changed. But what should churches be doing? And I mean, there is a sense in, I can't think of anything that the LDS could do that would get its numbers back to what they were 20 years ago, because the numbers 20 years ago were crazily high. And all the reasons why there was this, you get this thing in pastoral theology of, by Catholics or evangelicals that talk about Mormon envy, right? Because they look at the Mormons and it's like, wow, we should copy some of the things they do. Wouldn't it be great if we could get, all the young singles in, the parish or the kind of, the area to kind of come together, and then they can marry other good committed Catholics and all sorts of stuff, right? So there's a sense in which the LDS, and I talk as an outsider, I really don't know it like you do, and many of the viewers will know it. Looking at it from the outside, it seems to me that the LDS is doing everything that it could be doing, right? To kind of lean into the sorts of things you'd want to be doing to keep young adults in and that kind of stuff. But it's an uphill battle, and it's becoming more and more an uphill battle. I mean, honestly, there's no kind of if I was talking to any other, if I was talking, the Episcopalian stories, again, there wouldn't be an audience. No one would care, right?
Poor Episcopalians.
Anglican friends, this is, but you wouldn't be getting this kind of interest and real care about this in many other denominations. If I was talking to them, I'd be saying, well, if you talk to Mormons and ex-Mormons, they'll tell you that kind of everything is kind of, declining, which it is compared to what they're used to. But frankly, all the other churches, the best thing they could possibly do is, okay, don't write a new Bible, but everything else, maybe not name badges, but everything else, this would improve where you are now. And it's, if you go to the Philippines, the Philippines is one of the most Catholic places in the world, and it's full of young committed Catholics. You talk to them and they say, they talk about is secularization, and we're losing the young people. And it's almost like, well, compared to what you're used to, sure. But anywhere else in the world would dream of your kind of numbers. And there's a sense in which that almost anyone else, especially of big denominations, you can always, it's very easy to find a very small kind of group of super committed people that is kind of hived off. I mean, this is kind of like where things go weird and you end up with a Netflix special. But it's very easy to kind of form a bunker. But any kind of quasi mainstream large denomination is going to be dealing with exactly these kinds of problems, and have been dealing with them longer and have suffered more than the LDS is used to having to deal with.
Interesting. Yeah. Because I think I sit here as someone that's watching the church fall off a cliff, compared, again, having that perspective of compared to what I was told it would be like, it is nosediving. And again, the UK statistics show it's in free fall. And I'm there thinking, oh, what more could they do? And then from your outside perspective, you're looking at it going, actually, they're doing a lot of what they could do. To
I talked to my, I've talked to Mormon students, and, there's someone converting, those missionaries were like, wow. He sought them out as well. I mean, it's wonderful. Looking at it from the outside, then again, compared to everyone else, then, you know, much stronger kind of situation. Yeah.
Okay.
Stephen, let me ask you just as a side question. You've alluded to the answer to this question, but I want to hit it head on anyway. You know, there's this fascination these days with cults, whether it's I know, as someone who, you know, studied in the academy, that the term cult is discouraged in an academic setting, even when talking about organizations like Scientology or the Jehovah's Witnesses, mostly because I'm guessing it's either viewed as offensive or as non-productive. I struggle with that because even as we're all talking here right now, we're all acknowledging that there's a huge difference between Presbyterians and Lutherans and Episcopalians and Catholics and, you know, mainstream Jews. There's a huge difference between all of them and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and Scientologists. And a lot of that has to do with the types of behavioral controls, controls on information, thought control, punishment, you know, marginalization of the disaffected, and shunning that goes on, and even emotional manipulation. And so, you know, I'm very often torn between wanting to stay productive and scholarly and diplomatic and never, ever use that term, but then also wanting to give name to, you know, to practices and beliefs that lead to things like Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, that lead to things like Mark Hoffman or, you know, the Lafferty brothers, you know, religious excess that leads to, you know, just this past week in Ephraim, Utah, a devout Mormon father kills his wife, his 5 kids, and his mother-in-law, and then himself. And I'm going to guarantee you that when that story comes out, there's going to be elements of Mormonism that probably raised the stakes in severity that led to that sort of activity. So can you talk to us about, you know, how outsiders view the Mormon Church? You know, what to make of this term cult,
Yeah.
and how to make sense of it all?
No, I mean, you're right. I mean, the trouble with the world, you're right that academics don't. Some say, well, actually, it's a good word, and like when we talk about something like the Jonestown in Guyana, or you know,
Branch Davidians,
exactly,
or Nexium,
yeah, exactly. Then, so some say, well, actually, no. There's a certain sort of, and you know, with
religious movement,
a certain sort that actually this is a very good description for. Okay. And so yeah, but the trouble is that when it just gets used of everything, and because it does have you can't use it in a neutral way, right? It's not a term you can use in a kind of a neutral way, and rightly scholars want to be able to talk about things in a neutral way that it doesn't kind of prejudice the issue at hand. Now, it's certainly true that, I mean, any closed group, and you know, this isn't just religious groups, but any kind of closed group where, you know, people are deeply invested, where they're, you know, like hippie communes are a good example, right? You know, where or like kind of like, you know, Marxist communes, or, you know, like any kind of like these kind of small Maoist collectives in the 60s, you know, the kind of abuse that you kind of hear about from these, with a charismatic leader, you know, with all sorts of stuff. Things can go awry. And of course, you know, the Catholic, you know, the Cardinal McCarrick, you know, was just this kind of serial predator who kind of everyone knew about, but, you know, either everyone had, this was a Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., and it, you know, it was one of those things where he had a lot of friends in high. Everyone had a good reason to try and give him the benefit of the doubt. Like everyone was kind of implicated in some way. A bit like, I mean, Jeffrey Epstein's a good example. Harvey Weinstein, you know, people who a lot of people stand to fall if they fall, and so the whole system kind of protects them until hopefully it all does collapse, right? And that you see this you see this pattern in kind of US abuse in like US athletics, or abuse in Jimmy Savile was Nemo will know who I'm talking about, was a massive thing in Britain. He's kind of big kind of children's entertainer, essentially, beloved national treasure. He's been our worst serial predator. Hundreds and hundreds of victims. Just horrifying things that, all sorts of people, and when people do come forward, they're not believed, or, they're told, well, it's got to be your word against theirs, and that kind of stuff. So we see this pattern everywhere. Obviously, religion adds another element to that, and, the status of religious leaders and that kind of social stigma about speaking out and that kind of blaming the victims, you see that. But again, you see that, it's not just, you don't only see it, the classic example is these kind of like, bunker communities where everyone goes off and, there's no connection to the outside world. But of course, we see this in suburban parishes, we see this in all sorts of settings. So, I have nothing particularly profound to say on this, except to say that it's the more we learn about these kind of, power abuse dynamics and these sexual abuse dynamics, is that it's almost endemic. We see this all over, not just in religious settings. And I think the thing is that when you have religious groups, especially kind of like closed off religious groups where everyone is kind of, there's a real kind of social pressure to conform and to revere the leader and that kind of stuff. The FLDS are a classic example of this, but there's all sorts of examples. Is that it's very easy for those kinds of groups to go awry. They can be very. It's not saying that every small religious group will, but it's a kind of it's a system that's open to abuse, you might say. And yeah, again, it's awfully late on a Friday night, and I have nothing more profound to say on that topic, I'm afraid.
All right.
Suffixed every answer I've given with that caveat.
So, Nemo, I'm going to give you a chance to ask him any final questions, but I do want to ask you, how in the world does someone raised secular in the UK who's got 2 PhDs end up as a faithful devout Catholic? That may seem like an insulting question, but I know that my audience is very interested in
this is a huge story. Like, I'm going to give my testimony, and it's a bit like the thing in the Book of Moroni that, not quite, but lots of things. It was a long process, partly intellectual. One of the interesting things for me, I think, was that growing up in 1980s secular Britain, not even being baptized in a very nominal way, which lots of people still are, into the Church of England. Even if you don't practice, you don't believe, you still kind of baptize the kids, kind of thing. You were never really exposed to any of it. You were never kind of, I think a lot of former Christians, are kind of, they've often not been given a sort of a strong enough dose to for it to hold, but they've been given a sort of a weak enough dose to sort of turn them off it for life, a kind of vaccination kind of type thing. Dead strains of cultural Christianity kind of stops you ever catching it. I think for me, I went to university to study archaeology, wasn't enjoying it a few weeks in, and wanted to do philosophy, which I'd studied at high school. At Oxford, you can't just do philosophy, you have to do it with something. The only thing I was qualified to do it with was theology. You couldn't do it with maths or physics or something. So I thought, well, fine, I'll do the minimum theology and go off and be a philosopher. First time, I thought it was all nonsense. If the God delusion had come along when I was 17, that would have been me. First time I ever read a gospel. First time I'd ever seriously engaged with serious philosophical arguments. People like Thomas Aquinas, people like St. Augustine, people like, Alvin Plantinga, people like Richard Swinburne. Is a long intellectual process from thinking it's like literal nonsense to thinking, well, it's wrong, but it's interesting, to kind of thinking, maybe there's something to this. Plus, and I'm enough of a sociologist to know I was hanging out with Catholics. I was drinking with Dominican priests. And there is a socialization, in all kind of the way we adopt worldviews and beliefs. So I came to a point where I was, long story short, I'd been studying this stuff for 6-7 years, philosophy and theology at a fairly high level, doing a doctorate on 2 sentences of a Vatican document. And I'd got to the point when actually I thought, well, pretty sure I believe this stuff and I probably ought to go and do something about it. So then I was baptized and received into the Catholic Church in Rome. Getting on for 15 years ago.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, that you're right. I think that's its own podcast episode because I've got a million questions that I want to ask, and it's probably late there. Nemo, any final questions you want to ask Stephen?
Just what Stephen thinks of the ex-Mormon community, if he has engaged with it.
I
online.
love them all. Actually,
Right.
No, that was I said that as a joke, but actually it's true. And I don't mean that in any kind of glib way. What I mean by that is my engagement with the ex-Mo community is looking for when you go in to try and interview kind of dozens of people, there's all sorts of ways you try and get people to interview. You talk to friends, you kind of put word out, you kind of go on Reddit boards, you kind of do all stuff. Most places I'd go, I just put I wouldn't go to like the atheists group because you don't want a particular group, you want to kind of get the spectrum from everyone. So I'd go to like craft beer NYC and ask if people fit the bill to talk to, or whatever. And because there's so few, unless I'd gone to Utah, which I didn't, there's so few kind of ex-Mormons in any one place. I wanted to make sure I spoke to enough, so I went on to the ex-Mormon Reddit board, like 2018, I think. Just put who basically who wants me to buy them a beer or whatever, and I'm happy to talk. I know that. Really want to talk, keen to kind of include this thing in the thing, and obviously, being on the ex-Mormon board, it wasn't a full digital ethnography, but I'd read posts, I'd see what people were talking about, I'd see the kind of memes people. There's a good meme. I talk about this in the book. I particularly compliment the r/ex-Mormon board as having an excellent meme game.
Oh, perfect.
And as I say, I was deluged with, you're all, as I say, I'm going to say something offensively sort of stereotypical, but, everyone was very nice and willing to help. Very well brought up and, conscientious. And I was deluged with people wanting to tell their story. And, I ended up not just from that board, but in various places I spoke to maybe, I don't know, can't even think, maybe half a dozen, probably more, as full interviews for the book. And, I say this about all my interviewees because it's true about all the interviewees, but it was a real pleasure to talk to these people and for them to take time out of their day to sit down and, tell me their life story. So I don't spend my life there, but I've very warm feelings about the ex-Mormon community, at least on Reddit, which has been my kind of only connection, apart from,
well, we'll get you to a Thrive event and show you how ex-Mormons party.
All right. I want to be there. I want to be there when that happens.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Stephen Bullivant, thank you so much. The book is Nonverts, The Making of Ex-Christian America. You have many, many other books as well, so that by no means is your only book, but it's the one we're featuring today. We really appreciate your time and interest on our people, because it's really important for us to understand where we are, because our church won't tell us, frankly, even though they have the information. So it's nice to have other people who can, from an academic and objective standpoint, take a look and give us an update on how we're doing and how we're doing compared otherwise. But otherwise than that, you're just a delightful, thoughtful human. So thank you for coming on Mormon Stories.
Oh, it's a genuine pleasure. Can I tell people to like and subscribe?
Yeah,
smash the like and subscribe button. This is what I see.
Your daughters will be proud.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like and subscribe.
There you go.
I love it. Yeah, so please do subscribe, Mormon Stories viewers and listeners. Please subscribe to us on YouTube and on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and wherever else you see the podcast. And Stephen, how do people support you and your work and follow you?
Buy the book. If it's interesting you, buy the book. And honestly, if you like the book, tell others about it. Post about it on Facebook and Reddit and leave reviews on Amazon. I mean, like, genuinely, those sorts of things really, really help get the word out. And hopefully, it's a book that resonates with a significant number of listeners, viewers. Ex-Mormon or not, as I say, it's not a book about ex-Mormons. It's a book about America, and the ex-Mormon story is a distinctive and interesting one within that bigger picture.
That's great to know. All right, Stephen. Please don't be a stranger. We hope to have you back to tell your Catholic story. How does that sound?
Pleasure.
All right. And Nemo, you are the one that helped make this happen. Mm-hmm. You have an amazing channel. Please also go subscribe to Nemo the Mormon channel. Nemo, you just hit 10,000 subscribers. That's a big deal, right?
I did. Yeah, exciting. I redid my studio in honor of the milestone.
Yeah, 10,000 YouTube subscribers. That's no small deal. So keep that going, Nemo.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for all your help.
Anything else people can do to follow you or support you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess now's a good time to talk about it as any. I'm going full time with this, so any support, donations, any help, subscribes, likes, all that sort of stuff is helpful to me. And I just
how do people donate to you, Nemo?
There'll be links in the descriptions of my videos. I'm just setting up a donor box, and people can just subscribe, can give a monthly donation of however much they like, really.
That's amazing. Okay, yeah. Thanks, Nemo. Support Nemo the Mormon. Subscribe to his channel. And Nemo, we hope to have you back more in 2023. Do you think that's something we can count on, maybe?
I think so. Given that I'm going to have more time on my hands, I think you should keep me busy.
All right. Well, thanks, Nemo. Thanks for making this happen. Thanks again, Stephen. Keep up the good work.
Pleasure.
And thanks to everyone who's joined us today on Mormon Stories. The live stream was the live stream chat and comments were vibrant. We want to thank everyone who makes all this possible. And if you value content like this and you want to see it continue, you can go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, and become a monthly donor. That makes a big difference. And also, you can always send us a super chat. So you click on the little $sign in your YouTube chat window and send us a donation. And we're a nonprofit. We're transparent in our finances. And, your donations are tax deductible in the U.S. And every dollar you contribute, we try to use to improve our channel and support the mission of the organization. So please be good to each other. Be kind to each other. Support the programming that's valuable to you. And last but not least, please buy this book, Nonverts, The Making of Ex-Christian America, because we want to support good scholarship about the Mormon people and about religion in general. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Bye-bye.